My name is Rosalind Fletcher, and I'm 74 years old. As I sit in my small apartment in Maplewood, Ohio, watching the rain streak down my window, I can barely believe the story I'm about to tell you. It's a story about love, betrayal, and a courtroom moment that changed everything. You see, I thought I knew my son Garrett. I thought I understood what family meant. But sometimes the people closest to us can become strangers in ways we never imagined. 48 years ago, I was a young mother of 26, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table after my husband abandoned us. Garrett was just 2 years old then, with those bright blue eyes and curly brown hair that made everyone stop and smile. I remember holding him in that tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store, promising him that someday, somehow, I'd give him everything he deserved. Back then, I had nothing but love and determination. I worked as a night shift cleaner at the hospital, sold homemade pies at the farmer's market on weekends, and took in laundry from neighbors. My hands were always raw from washing clothes and scrubbing floors, but every dollar went toward Garrett's future. When other kids had new bicycles, I saved for months to buy him a secondhand one that I painted bright red in our kitchen. When he needed school supplies, I'd skip meals to make sure he had everything he needed. The sacrifices felt worth it when I'd see his face light up. He was my whole world, my reason for getting up at 4 in the morning and working until midnight. I'd sit with him at our little kitchen table, helping with homework I barely understood myself, because I dropped out of school at 16 to work. But I was determined that Garrett would have every opportunity I never had. By the time he turned 10, I'd managed to save enough to put a down payment on a small house on Elm Street. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a leaky roof, but it was ours. I'll never forget the day we moved in. Garrett ran through every room shouting with joy, and I cried right there in the empty living room. We'd made it. We had our own home. Those were the golden years looking back. Garrett played Little League baseball, and I never missed a game, even if I had to leave work early and lose pay. I'd sit in those metal bleachers cheering louder than any parent there, watching my boy round the bases like he was running toward his dreams. After games, we'd stop for ice cream at Peterson's Dairy, and he'd tell me about school, his friends, his plans for the future. When Garrett turned 16, I surprised him with driving lessons and eventually helped him buy his first car, a used Honda Civic that cost me 4 months of savings. The look on his face was worth every penny. He hugged me so tight that day, telling me I was the best mom in the world. Those words echoed in my heart for years. I held on to them like treasure, especially during the dark times that were coming. If you've ever sacrificed everything for someone you love, you'll understand what happens next. Keep watching to see how this mother's devotion leads to the most shocking betrayal. High school brought new challenges and bigger dreams. Garrett was smart, smarter than anyone in our family had ever been. His grades were excellent, and his teachers constantly praised his potential. When college applications came around, I knew we had to aim high. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Mrs. Fletcher, Garrett could get into any university in the country. Don't let financial limitations hold him back." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, bills, and college brochures spread everywhere. The numbers were terrifying. Even with scholarships, we'd need at least $60,000 for a good 4-year education. I was making barely $30,000 a year at that time, working as a receptionist at Dr. Morrison's dental office while cleaning offices at night. But I'd made a promise to that little 2-year-old boy years ago, and I wasn't about to break it now. I took out a second mortgage on our house. I cashed in my small retirement fund, paying the penalties without a second thought. I even sold my mother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing I owned that had belonged to my family. That ring had been on my finger for 23 years, but Garrett's education mattered more. When the acceptance letter came from Northwestern University, Garrett and I both cried. He was going to study business and economics, dreaming of starting his own company someday. I was so proud I called everyone I knew. Mrs. Henderson next door, the ladies at church, even my coworkers. I couldn't stop talking about my brilliant son who was going to college. The 4 years he was away were the loneliest of my life, but also filled with purpose. I worked even harder, picking up extra shifts, selling baked goods at local events, anything to keep sending him money for books, supplies, and living expenses. Every phone call home filled my heart with joy. He'd tell me about his classes, his professors, the amazing opportunities he was discovering. During his junior year, Garrett called with exciting news. He developed a business plan for a tech startup focused on rural internet solutions. His professor was impressed, and there was talks about potential investors. "Mom," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement, "this could be huge. This could change our lives forever." I could hear the dreams in his voice, and I wanted to help make them real. That's when I made the biggest financial decision of my life. I took out a loan against the house for $50,000 and sent it to Garrett to help fund his startup. The bank officer, Mr. Phillips, tried to talk me out of it. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said gently, "this is a significant risk. Are you sure about this? But when your child has a dream and you have the power to help make it happen, what choice do you have?" Garrett was overwhelmed with gratitude. He flew home that weekend just to hug me and promised that he'd pay me back 10 times over. We sat in our kitchen, the same one where I'd helped him with homework all those years, and he showed me charts and graphs I didn't understand, explaining how his company would revolutionize internet access in small towns across the Midwest. His eyes shone with ambition and hope, and I felt like the luckiest mother in the world. When he graduated summa cum laude, I was there in the audience, wearing the only nice dress I owned, crying tears of pure pride. My son, the boy I'd raised alone, was now a college graduate with a business degree and a dream that was about to take flight. Everything I sacrificed, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, led to this moment. The next 5 years were a whirlwind of growth and excitement. Garrett's company, Connect Rural, took off faster than either of us had imagined. What started as a college business plan became a $1 million enterprise, providing high-speed internet to small towns and farming communities across the Midwest. I watched my son transform from an eager graduate to a confident businessman, and my heart swelled with pride every day. He moved to Chicago to manage the growing company, but he never forgot where he came from. Every month he'd drive down to Maplewood to visit, usually bringing flowers and sometimes small gifts. He'd insist on taking me to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, Romano's Italian Bistro, where the waitresses knew us by name. "Mom," he'd say, raising his glass of wine while I sipped my iced tea, "none of this would be possible without you. You're my hero." During this time, Garrett insisted on paying off the mortgage on my house. I protested, but he wouldn't hear of it. "You sacrificed everything for my education," he said firmly. "The least I can do is make sure you own your home free and clear." The day we walked out of the bank together, mortgage papers marked paid in full, I felt a sense of security I hadn't experienced in decades. He also set up a monthly allowance for me, $2,000 that came like clockwork every month. It was more money than I'd ever had in my life. For the first time, I could go to the grocery store without checking prices, could treat myself to a nice lunch with friends, could even take small trips to visit my sister in Kentucky. Garrett called it Mom's Retirement Fund, though I was still working part-time at the dental office because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Connect Rural's success attracted attention from bigger tech companies. When Garrett called to tell me that a major telecommunications corporation wanted to buy his company for $43 million, I nearly dropped the phone. My little boy, who used to count pennies to buy candy at Murphy's store, was about to become a multimillionaire. The sale went through when Garrett was 31 years old. He called me from the lawyer's office, laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it, Mom! We actually did it!" That weekend, he surprised me with a brand new Honda Accord, my first new car ever. I sat in the driveway, running my hands over the leather seats, amazed that my life had taken such an incredible turn. But success changed Garrett in ways I didn't recognize at first. The monthly visits became less frequent, every other month, then every 3 months. Phone calls grew shorter and more focused on business matters. When he did visit, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone, taking calls during dinner. I attributed it to the pressures of managing his wealth and exploring new business ventures. Around this time, Garrett started dating Vivian Blackstone, a lawyer from Chicago whose family owned several successful restaurants. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and intelligent, everything I thought my son deserved. When he brought her to meet me, I went all out, cleaning the house for days, cooking his favorite pot roast, and buying a new tablecloth for the occasion. The dinner was pleasant enough, though I noticed Vivian's eyes surveying my modest home with what seemed like polite disdain. She asked pointed questions about my background, my education, my family history. Later, I overheard her telling Garrett in the kitchen, "She seems sweet, honey, but she's quite simple, isn't she?" I pretended not to hear, but the words stung more than I cared to admit. Success was supposed to bring our family closer together, but sometimes money changes people in ways we never expect. Stay with me to see how my son's wealth became the beginning of our greatest trial. Garrett and Vivian married 2 years later in an elaborate ceremony at the Palmer House in Chicago. The wedding cost more than I'd made in 5 years, with 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and flowers flown in from Ecuador. I felt out of place among the wealthy attendees in my department store dress, but Garrett made sure I felt included, introducing me proudly as the woman who made all of this possible. During the reception, I sat at a table with some of Vivian's relatives, listening to them discuss their vacation homes, their children's private schools, their stock portfolios. When they asked about my background, I mentioned my years cleaning offices and working at the dental practice. The conversation grew awkward, and I excused myself early, claiming I was tired from the long drive. That night in my hotel room, I called my sister Dorothy in Kentucky. "I'm happy for Garrett, but I feel like I'm losing him to a world I don't understand." Dorothy, who had always been more practical than me, said gently, "Honey, sometimes when our children grow up and move away, we have to accept that they're becoming people we didn't expect. That doesn't mean he loves you any less." For a while, it seemed like Dorothy might be right. Garrett and Vivian bought a beautiful home in Lincoln Park, and they'd invite me for holidays. Vivian was always polite, though I could sense her discomfort with my presence. She'd make subtle comments about my clothes, my grammar, my stories about the old days in Maplewood. Garrett didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to see it. The birth of their first child, my grandson Zachary, brought temporary joy back to our relationship. Garrett was over the moon about becoming a father, and he wanted me involved in his son's life. I drive to Chicago every few weeks to help with babysitting, and those were precious times. Little Zachary had his father's blue eyes and his grandmother's stubborn streak, and I fell in love with him immediately. But Vivian became increasingly possessive about Zachary's care. She'd hover whenever I held him,
making comments about proper feeding techniques or sleep schedules that I supposedly didn't understand. When Zachary was 6 months old, she enrolled him in an exclusive daycare program that cost more per month than my old mortgage payment. "We want him to be around the right kind of children," she explained when I asked why they needed daycare when I was available to help. The monthly allowance Garrett had been sending me suddenly stopped when Zachary turned 1. When I called to ask about it, Garrett sounded uncomfortable. "Mom, Vivian and I have been talking about our finances. With the baby and the new house, we need to be more careful about our spending. I'm sure you understand." I assured him I did, though I wondered how a multimillionaire could be worried about $2,000 a month for his mother. I went back to working full-time at Dr. Morrison's office, though I now was 63 and my arthritis made the long days difficult. The new financial pressure meant I had to be careful about driving to Chicago to see Zachary, since gas and parking were expensive. My visits became less frequent, which Vivian seemed to prefer. During one visit, I overheard Vivian on the phone with her sister saying, "I love Garrett dearly, but his mother is such an embarrassment. She has no education, no class, no understanding of how to behave in polite society. I cringe every time she opens her mouth at social functions. I've been encouraging Garrett to establish some boundaries." That night, I lay in their guest bedroom staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd made a mistake in sacrificing so much for my son's success. Had I created a person who was now ashamed of where he came from? Had my love somehow prepared him to leave me behind? The next morning at breakfast, Garrett announced that he and Vivian were expecting their second child. I hugged them both and offered my congratulations, but I could see the look that passed between them when I suggested I could help with Zachary when the new baby arrived. "We'll see, Mom," Garrett said vaguely. "We'll see." When their daughter Penelope was born, I wasn't invited to the hospital. Garrett called 3 days later to inform me of her arrival, explaining that Vivian wanted to keep visitors to a minimum during the first few weeks. "You understand, don't you, Mom? She's just being protective." I said I understood, but it felt like another door closing between us. Around this time, Garrett became involved in a new business venture, a luxury resort development project in Colorado. He was investing heavily in the project, partnering with developers who promised incredible returns. When he told me about it during one of his increasingly rare phone calls, his excitement reminded me of his college days when he first pitched his internet company. "This isn't just about money, Mom. This is about creating something lasting, something I can pass down to Zachary and Penelope. We're talking about a world-class destination that will generate income for generations." His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself caught up in his vision, even though I didn't fully understand the complex financial arrangements he described. But as months passed, the project seemed to consume more and more of his resources. He mentioned needing additional capital, dealing with unexpected environmental permits, managing construction delays. When I asked if everything was all right, he assured me it was just normal business challenges. "Every great venture has obstacles, Mom. That's what separates successful people from everyone else." One afternoon, Garrett called with a request that surprised me. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know how hard this is for me to ask. The resort project needs a significant cash infusion to move to the next phase. I've exhausted my liquid assets, and the bank wants additional collateral for the loan I need." He paused, and I could hear the difficulty in his voice. "Would you be willing to put your house up as collateral? It's just temporary, until the project generates revenue." My house was all I had left in the world. My security, my independence, my connection to the memories Garrett and I had built together. But this was my son, asking for help with a dream that could secure his children's future. How could I say no? "Of course, honey," I heard myself saying. "Whatever you need."
The legal process was complicated, involving lawyers and notaries and documents I didn't fully understand. Garrett's attorney, a stern man named Bradford Pierce, explained that I was essentially guaranteeing Garrett's business loan with my property. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said seriously, "do you understand that if the business fails to repay this loan, you could lose your home?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding. Garrett squeezed my hand and promised, "That will never happen, Mom. I'd die before I'd let you lose your house." For a while, everything seemed to be going well. Garrett sent me photos of the construction progress. Beautiful mountain views, luxury cabins taking shape, a main lodge that looked like something from a fairy tale. He talked about flying me out for the grand opening, giving me my own suite to stay in whenever I wanted. The vision was so compelling that I began to see my house as just a piece of paper, a temporary tool to help build something magnificent. But by the end of that year, Garrett's calls became more infrequent and more strained. When I did hear from him, he sounded tired and stressed. The project had encountered more delays, more cost overruns, more regulatory challenges than anyone had anticipated. The developers were demanding additional funding, and investors were getting nervous. Sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. What I discovered next about my son's business dealings will shock you to your core. Keep watching. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but love makes us blind to the people we trust most. The first red flag came when Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, mentioned seeing a "for sale" sign in front of my house. I rushed outside to find a realtor's placard planted in my front yard like some kind of cruel joke. My hands shook as I called the number listed. The realtor, a young woman named Patricia Wells, sounded confused when I identified myself as the homeowner. "Ma'am, according to our records, this property is owned by Connect Rural Holdings, LLC. We received instructions to list it for immediate sale." My blood turned to ice. Connect Rural was Garrett's original company name, the one he'd sold years earlier. Why would a property deed show that name? I spent the next 3 days making frantic phone calls, trying to understand what had happened to my home. Finally, a patient clerk at the county recorder's office explained the situation. When I'd signed those legal documents to help with the Garrett Resort project, I hadn't just put my house up as collateral. I had somehow transferred ownership to his business entity. The papers I'd trusted him to handle had stripped me of my home entirely. When I called Garrett, he didn't answer. I left message after message, my voice growing more desperate each time. Finally, Vivian called back. Her voice was cold and businesslike, nothing like the polite facade she'd maintained for years. "Rosalind," she said, using my first name instead of calling me Mom, "Garrett is dealing with some very serious business issues right now. The resort project failed, and there are significant debts that need to be resolved." "But my house," I whispered. "This is my home. Where am I supposed to live?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I'm sure you can find somewhere affordable. There are some nice senior communities in the area, I'm told. Garrett will call you when he can." The line went dead. 3 weeks later, I received an eviction notice. The new owners, a property investment company, wanted me out within 30 days so they could prepare the house for resale. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd helped Garrett with homework, where we'd celebrated his college acceptance, where he'd promised to take care of me forever, and I cried harder than I had the day his father left us. But my tears turned to fury when I discovered the truth about Connect Rural Holdings. Through a friend whose son worked in Chicago real estate, I learned that this wasn't just a failed business venture. It was part of an elaborate financial scheme. Garrett had been transferring assets, including my home, into various shell companies to shield his wealth from potential creditors and legal judgments. The resort project was real, but it was designed to fail from the beginning. Garrett and his partners had inflated construction costs, paid themselves enormous consulting fees, and diverted funds to offshore accounts. When the project inevitably collapsed, they could claim massive losses while keeping their personal wealth protected. My house wasn't collateral that got lost in a failed venture. It was deliberately stolen as part of a criminal conspiracy. I spent my saving life on a lawyer, a kind older gentleman named Robert Chen, who specialized in elder financial abuse. When I showed him the documents, his face grew grave. He said sadly, "Mrs. Fletcher, your son has committed some serious crimes. This isn't just financial manipulation, it's fraud, elder abuse, and possibly money laundering.
The question is, are you prepared to take legal action against your own child? That night, I sat in the tiny efficiency apartment I'd been forced to rent, surrounded by boxes containing the remnants of my life. And I made the hardest decision I'd ever faced. I was going to fight back. I was going to expose what Garrett had done to me, not just to me, but to other investors he'd defrauded. If he could throw away 48 years of love and sacrifice for money, then I would show him that some things were more powerful than greed. The next morning, I called Mr. Chen and told him to file whatever papers were necessary. My son had declared war on me, and now he was going to discover just how strong the woman who raised him was really. Filing a lawsuit against your own child feels like signing your name to a death certificate for your heart. But as I sat in Mr. Chen's office reviewing the mountain of evidence we'd gathered about Garrett's fraud, I knew I had no choice. He hadn't just stolen my house, he had stolen my entire sense of who I thought he was. The lawsuit we filed was comprehensive and damning. We sued for fraud, elder financial abuse, conversion of property, and civil conspiracy. But Mr. Chen had an even shocking revelation for me. Mrs. Fletcher, based on our investigation, we believe your son has defrauded other investors out of nearly $200 million through various schemes over the past 5 years. Your case might be the key that opens the floodgates. When the papers were served, Garrett's response was swift and vicious. Instead of calling to explain or apologize, he hired the most expensive legal team in Chicago and filed a countersuit against me for $200 million. His claim that I had been stealing from him for years, manipulating him emotionally to extract money, and that all the funds he'd provided for my care and housing were actually loans that I'd never repaid. Reading that countersuit felt like being stabbed in the chest with a rusty knife. According to Garrett's version of our relationship, I was a greedy, manipulative woman who had taken advantage of his success. The monthly allowances he'd given me? Loans. The mortgage he paid off? A loan. Even the money I'd given him for college. According to his lawyers, that was somehow money I owed him for raising him in substandard conditions that damaged his earning potential. The media attention was immediate and brutal. Local grandmother in multi-million-dollar battle with tech millionaire son, read the headline in the Chicago Tribune. The story painted me as either a sympathetic victim or a money-hungry opportunist, depending on which quotes they chose to highlight. Reporters showed up at my tiny apartment asking questions I didn't know how to answer.
But the worst part was seeing Garrett on television, giving interviews where he portrayed himself as the victim of an elderly mother's greed. He sat in his beautiful Lincoln Park home with Vivian beside him, looking appropriately wounded, and told the interviewer, "My mother is clearly suffering from some form of dementia or mental illness. It breaks my heart to see her making these wild accusations, but I have to protect my family from her increasingly erratic behavior." Dementia, mental illness, erratic behavior. Each word was chosen to make me seem like a confused old woman who didn't understand reality. The boy I'd raised, the son I'd sacrificed everything for, was now publicly questioning my sanity to protect his stolen wealth. I turned off the television and cried until I had no tears left. Mr. Chen warned me that Garrett's legal strategy would be character assassination. They're going to try to prove you're mentally incompetent, that you signed documents without understanding them, that you've been manipulated by me into filing this lawsuit, he explained. Are you prepared for them to attack everything about you, your education, your past, your mental capacity? I thought about the woman who had worked 3 jobs to feed her toddler son, who had scrubbed floors and sold pies to pay for his education, who had mortgaged her future to fund his dreams. That woman had been strong enough to raise a child alone and build a life from nothing. She was certainly strong enough to face her son in court. Let them come, I told Mr. Chen. I've been underestimated my whole life. Let's see how that works out for them. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed the full scope of Garrett's deception. Bank records showed systematic asset transfers designed to hide wealth, falsified documents used to defraud investors, and a pattern of financial abuse targeting elderly victims who trusted him. My case wasn't unique. I was just the most vulnerable target in a much larger criminal enterprise. But the most devastating discovery came when we found emails between Garrett and Vivian discussing me. In one exchange from 2 years earlier, Vivian had written, "Your mother is becoming a liability. She knows too much about your early business practices, and her sentimental attachment to that house makes her unpredictable. We need to find a way to neutralize her as a potential witness." Garrett's response chilled me to the bone. "You're right. The house transfer will serve two purposes. It gives us another asset to protect, and it makes her financially dependent on us. A desperate old woman is easier to control than an independent one." The months leading up to the trial were the loneliest of my life, but also strangely empowering. As word spread about the case, I began hearing from other people Garrett had deceived: elderly investors who'd lost their retirement funds, small business owners who had been promised partnerships that never materialized, even some of his former employees who'd been cheated out of promised stock options. One woman, Barbara Steinberg from Wisconsin, drove 6 hours to meet me at a diner in Maplewood. She was 78 years old, a widow who'd invested her late husband's life insurance payout in one of Garrett's guaranteed return investment schemes. "I lost everything," she told me, her hands shaking as she showed me documents. "My husband worked 43 years as a machinist, saved every penny he could, and your son stole it all with fancy talk and fake promises." Hearing Barbara's story and the stories of dozens of other victims transformed my perspective on the lawsuit. This wasn't just about recovering my house anymore. It was about stopping a predator who had used his education and charm to devastate elderly people who trusted him. The son I had raised would never have hurt innocent people like this. The man he'd become was someone I didn't recognize. Mr. Chen assembled an impressive legal team, including a forensic accountant named Diana Walsh, who specialized in tracking hidden assets. Diana discovered that Garrett had moved millions of dollars through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, creating a paper trail that led to properties in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and even a yacht registered in Panama. "Your son is sophisticated in his criminal enterprise," Diana explained during one of our strategy meetings, "but he made critical errors because he got overconfident. He kept detailed records of his schemes, probably for tax purposes, and those records are going to be his downfall." Meanwhile, Garrett's legal team was working overtime to destroy my credibility. They subpoenaed my medical records, interviewed people I'd known decades ago, and even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt about my past. When they couldn't find any evidence of wrongdoing, they began spreading rumors about my mental state and my motives. The most hurtful attack came when they questioned my fitness as a mother, suggesting that Garrett's criminal behavior was somehow the result of my inadequate parenting. Vivian gave a deposition claiming that Garrett had always felt emotionally manipulated by my sacrifices, that my working multiple jobs had been a form of psychological abuse designed to make him feel guilty and obligated. But their character assassination backfired when Mr. Chen discovered something interesting in Vivian's background. Her family's restaurant business had been investigated by the IRS for tax evasion, and she had been peripherally involved in several questionable financial transactions before marrying Garrett. The perfect, sophisticated woman who looked down on my humble background had her own history of ethical shortcuts. 3 weeks before the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Dorothy, my sister from Kentucky, showed up at my apartment with a suitcase and a determined expression. "I'm staying until this is over. You shouldn't have to face this alone." Having her there reminded me that I wasn't as isolated as I'd felt. I had people who believed in me, people who knew the truth about who I was. The night before the trial began, I sat in my tiny kitchen, drinking coffee and reading through my testimony one more time. Mr. Chen had prepared me for every possible question, every attack on my character, every attempt to confuse or intimidate me. But the most important preparation had come from within myself. I had written a letter, not to the court, not to my lawyers, but to the son I had raised and lost. In it, I poured out 48 years of love,
disappointment, and heartbreak. I wrote about the sacrifices, the dreams, the hopes, and the ultimate betrayal. I wrote about the woman who had scrubbed floors so he could have books, and the man who had stolen her home to protect his wealth. The courtroom showdown is about to begin, and what happens next will determine not just the outcome of this case, but the future of a mother's broken heart. The judge's reaction to my letter will surprise you. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and some of Garrett's other victims who'd come to see justice served. I sat at the plaintiff's table in my best dress, the same one I'd worn to his college graduation, and tried to steady my trembling hands. Across the room, Garrett sat with his expensive legal team, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than I'd made in 6 months. He wouldn't look at me. Judge Margaret Hoffman was a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense in her courtroom. As she reviewed the case files, I prayed that she would see through Garrett's lies and understand the truth about what he'd done to me and so many others.
Garrett's lawyers went first, painting me as a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the legal document she'd signed. They argued that all the money Garrett had given me over the years were loans, not gifts, and that I was now trying to manipulate the legal system to avoid repaying my debts. Their star witness was Dr. Edwin Powell, a psychiatrist they'd hired to evaluate my mental competency based solely on my legal filings. Ms. Fletcher exhibits classic signs of age-related cognitive decline, Dr. Powell testified confidently. Her unrealistic expectations about her son's financial obligations, combined with her apparent inability to understand complex legal documents, suggest diminished capacity that would make her testimony unreliable. Listening to this stranger question my sanity was infuriating, but Mr. Chin had prepared me for this. When it came time for cross-examination, he systematically dismantled Dr. Powell's credibility, revealing that the doctor had been paid $50,000 for his opinion and had never actually met me or conducted any legitimate mental health evaluation. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As I looked out at the packed courtroom, I saw faces I recognized, some of Garrett's other victims, my neighbors from Maplewood, even Mrs. Henderson, who had driven down to support me. Mr. Chin guided me through my testimony carefully, starting with my early years as a single mother, the sacrifices I'd made for Garrett's education, and the gradual deterioration of our relationship after his marriage to Vivienne. I told the story simply and honestly, without embellishment or drama, letting the facts speak for themselves. But the most powerful moment came when Garrett's lead attorney, a slick man named Jonathan Pierce, began his cross-examination. He tried to rattle me with aggressive questioning about my memory, my understanding of financial matters, my motives for filing the lawsuit. Isn't it true, Mrs. Fletcher, that you're simply a bitter old woman who resents her son's success? That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter I'd written to Garrett. Your Honor, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months, I'm writing something I wrote for my son, something that explains exactly who I am and why I'm here. Judge Hoffman looked surprised, but nodded for me to proceed. With the entire courtroom silent, I began to read. Dear Garrett, I'm writing this letter because I need you to remember who you used to be, and I need this court to understand who I am. I'm the woman who held you when you had nightmares, who walked 5 miles to work when our car broke down so I could still afford your school supplies. I'm the woman who sold her mother's wedding ring to help pay for your college, who took out loans against her home to fund your dreams.
As I continued reading, describing our early years together, the sacrifices, the love, the hopes I had for his future, I noticed something remarkable happening in the courtroom. The reporters had stopped taking notes and were simply listening. Some of the jurors were wiping their eyes. Even Judge Hoffman was leaning forward, absorbed in the story. But most importantly, for the first time since the trial began, Garrett was looking at me, really looking at me, and I could see tears streaming down his face. I finished the letter with these words: I don't know what happened to the little boy who promised to take care of me forever, but I'm here today not just to get my house back, but to remind you that some things are more valuable than money. The love between a mother and child should be one of those things. The courtroom was completely silent for a long moment after I finished reading. Then Judge Hoffman did something unexpected. She looked directly at Garrett and said, Mr. Fletcher, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Did you deliberately defraud your mother out of her home? What happened next will stay with me for the rest of my life. Garrett looked at his expensive lawyers, then at Vivienne sitting in the gallery, then finally at me. The mask he'd been wearing throughout the trial seemed to crumble, and I saw glimpses of the little boy I had raised. Yes, he whispered so quietly that the court reporter had to ask him to repeat himself. Yes, Your Honor, I deliberately took my mother's house. I convinced her to sign papers she didn't understand, and I used her love for me to steal her home. His voice broke. I've been stealing from a lot of people, but taking my mother's house, that was the worst thing I've ever done. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Garrett's lawyers looked horrified at their client's sudden confession, and Vivienne's face went pale. Judge Hoffman banged her gavel for order, but even she was shaken by this unexpected turn. Your Honor, Garrett continued, standing up despite his lawyer's frantic attempts to stop him, I want to confess to everything. The resort fraud, the investment schemes, all of it. My mother raised me to be honest and decent, and I became the opposite of everything she taught me. I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I can at least tell the truth. What followed was 3 hours of detailed confession that exposed the full scope of Garrett's criminal enterprise. He named co-conspirators, revealed hidden accounts, and provided information that would allow prosecutors to recover millions of dollars stolen from elderly victims. The federal agents who had been quietly observing the trial immediately took him under custody. But before they led him away, Judge Hoffman granted my request for one final moment with my son. I walked over to where he sat in handcuffs, and for the first time in years, I saw the child I had loved unconditionally.
I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve it, but can you ever forgive me? I looked at this man who had broken my heart, stolen my home, and betrayed everything I had taught him. I thought about the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him stories, who used to promise to take care of me when I got old, who used to be my whole world. I forgave you the moment you told the truth, I said softly. That's what mothers do. Judge Hoffman's final ruling was swift and comprehensive. She ordered the immediate return of my house, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. She also ordered the seizure of all of Garrett's assets to compensate his other victims, and she recommended that federal prosecutors pursue criminal charges to the fullest extent of the law. But the most important moment came when she addressed the packed courtroom.
This case represents more than financial fraud. It represents the betrayal of the most fundamental trust that exists between parent and child. Mrs. Fletcher's love for her son never wavered, even when he used that love as a weapon against her. That kind of unconditional love is what should guide all of us in our relationships with family. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. I had my house back, but more importantly, I had my truth validated. The woman who had scrubbed floors and sold pies to raise her son had proven that integrity was stronger than corruption, and love was more powerful than greed. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen in Maplewood, Ohio, the same kitchen where this whole story began. The house looks exactly the same as it did before I lost it, but everything feels different now. I've received letters from dozens of Garrett's victims thanking me for having the courage to expose his crimes. The FBI recovered over $150 million that has been returned to the people he defrauded. Garrett is serving a 12-year sentence in federal prison. I visit him once a month, not because he deserves it, but because he's still my son. Prison has humbled him in ways that wealth never could. He's taking classes, reading books, and slowly becoming the man I always believed he could be. Vivienne divorced him before the trial ended and moved back to her family in California with the children. I haven't seen Zachary and Penelope since the trial, but I send them birthday cards and Christmas presents. Maybe someday, when they're older, they'll want to know their grandmother's side of the story. People often ask me if I regret the sacrifices I made for Garrett, if I wish I had kept that money for myself instead of funding his education and dreams. The answer is complicated. I regret that my love was used against me, but I don't regret loving him. I don't regret believing in his potential, even when he stopped believing in himself. The truth is, the woman who raised Garrett Fletcher, the woman who worked 3 jobs and sold her mother's ring and mortgaged her future for his education, she was strong enough to survive his betrayal and fight back. She was strong enough to forgive him when he finally told the truth, and she's strong enough to keep loving him, even from a distance. As I finish writing this story, I want you to remember something important. The people who love us most are often the ones who can hurt us deepest. But love isn't just about trust and sacrifice. Sometimes love means standing up for yourself when the people you've given everything to try to take even more. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be anyone's victim, even when that person is your own child. My name is Rosalind Fletcher. I'm 74 years old. I live in a small house in Maplewood, Ohio, and I survived the ultimate betrayal by never forgetting who I was, a mother who loved without limits, but who was strong enough to demand the truth when love wasn't enough.
What did you think of Rosalind's incredible journey? Have you ever had to stand up to someone you loved who was treating you wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true-to-life stories that will touch your heart and open your eyes. In the meantime, on the final screen, I'm leaving you with 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I'm sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until now.